I am Pocho Salcedo. Greetings to our viewers, TV stations in Latin America, and those tuning broadcasts and cable systems from coast to coast across the continental United States and Hawaii. Here in New York, we are ready to decode the stories that shape our world. This is not just the news, this is the DNA of the news. Climate change delay recognition mirrors another global crisis, the illicit drug trade, a problem that affects us all. With 300 million people using illegal drugs regularly across the world, this issue transcends borders and cultures, from Latin America's record cocaine production to methamphetamines surge in Asia and fentanyl overdoses in North America. This problem devastates health, society, and the environment on a global scale. Criminal networks exploit instability, damage ecosystems, and fuel other crimes like human trafficking. Welcome to our deep dive into this issue that unites us all. We have with us a world-class expert.
Ian Hamilton is an honorary fellow, associate professor, in addiction at the Department of Health Sciences. Ian has experience of providing clinical help to people who have problems with drugs and mental health prior to joining the University of York in 2004. This blend of clinical and academic experience has informed his teaching and role as a facilitator. Ian engages with a range of media outlets, providing expert commentary on topical news stories related to drugs and alcohol, as well as working with producers on investigative stories and documentaries. He writes a weekly column for The Independent and contributes regularly to the British Medical Journal and The Conversation.
Well, thank you very much. We are so pleased to have you in the show. And I would like to talk a little bit about the environmental impact of drug production. At the center of your thesis is the assertion that drug production, such as cocaine, impacts both society and the environment at every stage of the process. Could you provide us specific examples of how this relationship unfolds in South America and coca farming or across the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that happens is when you're producing cocoa on land, the cocoa leaf used to produce cocaine, you're kind of giving way to crops that would be used to feed people, arable crops, whether that's wheat or corn or whatever it is. So that's what economists call an opportunity cost. So if you replace one crop with another, you're obviously prioritizing cocoa production over food that people need to eat. And we know that land is scarce across the world. So any land that's taken out of arable production is a potential threat to local communities and humanity on a wider scale. But what really concerns me is the way that cocaine is produced, because the toxic chemicals that are used in that process damage not only the soil, but local and nearby water passages, so whether it be streams or rivers, and it pollutes them. So although you might have a cocoa crop for 1 year, the legacy of the production of that drug can last for several years, if not decades, in terms of damaging the soil where it's been produced, but also the waterways that people rely on for drinking water, etc. So it's not just a short-term problem, it's also, I think, a longer-term problem in terms of the damage environmentally that drug production causes.
Well, thank you very much. And you've been championing this global blind spot on drugs and talking about it. You have drawn a parallel between the existential threats posed by drugs and climate change. Given the overwhelming evidence of the harm drugs cause devastating institutions, communities, and individuals alike, why do you think the world has been so slow to recognize and address the threat posed by drugs, by drug use on a global scale?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. One is we know that there's been a time lag between the science pointing to global warming, for instance, and people actually beginning to accept that global warming is a fact and a feature of several of the weather events that we see. And I think the same thing is happening with drugs. We've seen a time lag between the evidence that drugs are causing harm to our communities and societies, and people actually, people like you and I, accepting the fact that's happening. So, this is a well-known phenomenon, this kind of long time lag between the science, the evidence, the research, and people becoming aware of how that impacts their lives and those around them. So I think in some ways we're all to blame. We can't turn to politicians and start pointing the finger and say they've not done enough, because politicians only care about what we care about. And if we don't care about the problems that drugs are causing, why should politicians care? They rely on us for their votes, don't they? For their kind of sustained careers, as it were. So I think once we all, or the majority of us, wake up to this, accept it, and see it something as a priority, and expect our politicians to do something about it, then we can't blame politicians. We have to look at ourselves and those around us and think, are we sufficiently concerned?
Well, thank you. Professor, for decades, drug problems have been primarily framed as affecting Western nations like Europe, North America, and Australia. However, UN data indicates that about 300 million people worldwide use illicit drugs regularly, with about 64 million suffering from drug disorders. How has this problem grown into a truly global issue, transcending the traditional narrative it's a Western crisis only?
I think that's a really important point. And of course, one of the things that's driven that is that Western countries have been very good at researching and collecting data. Whereas if we think about the continent of Africa, Asia, and even the Middle East, the data there has been difficult to get hold of. So we don't know what the extent of the problem has been, but that's beginning to emerge. So if we look at Syria, which has been a really troubled state for several years, that's a really interesting example of what's happened in terms of our understanding of how widespread drug use and its problems are. So Syria, under Bashar Assad, the recently exiled president, has become the Middle East hub for the production of a stimulant called captagon. And while sanctions have been imposed on Syria, which has really crippled its economy, the production, supply, and distribution of captagon as a drug across the Middle East has been worth billions of dollars to Syria, and in some ways propped up that regime. So that's just one example of how drugs, play a really critical role, not just in local communities, but for regimes and governments. They can keep a government actually financially credible, which is quite a concept, really, when you think of the size of a country like Syria.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a really important point. And adding to that, in the same way that climate change has threatened whole populations, so to have drugs, although we, in many occasions, often we are disconnected and from the production and distribution, and the misery these phenomena causes throughout the supply chain worldwide. Cocaine, for example, is associated with violence, exploitation at every stage of the manufacturing process, death threats, media, hundreds of people slaughtered almost on a weekly basis. Why is this situation so ignored as it is not happening? You mentioned the research, but there's a lot of ample information about the violence, for example, that goes on.
I think there's a number of factors at play. It's difficult to pinpoint one thing exactly. But, drug use and problems with drugs is heavily stigmatized. It's not something people talk about or want to talk about. So we know within our own families, our own circle of friends, that if someone develops a problem with drugs, it's not usually talked about. It's certainly not something people would share. So unlike mental health, which has seen a massive change in the way people are willing to talk about that and share experience, we've not seen that with problematic drug use. So it's something that's very much kept suppressed, something that people feel ashamed about. And one of the problems with shame and stigma is it actually causes a lot of harm because people don't seek help and treatment in a timely way. So we've seen that. So, for instance, one example is the opioid crisis in America, which has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives every year. And, some of that is driven by shame and stigma. Some of it is actually driven by the pharmaceutical industry itself in terms of promoting, opioids like oxycodone and other very powerful painkillers, which people don't need, but were given and then become dependent. And then once those prescriptions dry up or they're no longer given, people look to alternatives like heroin or fentanyl. And that's what we're seeing in the current Trump administration is his absolute determination to reduce the supply of fentanyl from Mexico, which is now the leading supplier of that drug, that opioid drug, which is very, very strong, into America. And how successful he's going to be with that, I don't know.
Well, there's also a criminal element in this ecosystem of drugs and organized crime networks are often involved in more than just drug trafficking. They also exploit people through the commercial sex trade and other forms of modern slavery. In the United States, they are primarily the drivers of illegal immigration as well. Could you shed light on how drug networks become intertwined with other forms of exploitation?
Well, I mean, obviously both are illegal. Human trafficking and illicit drug use are both illegal. But beyond that, what you see is the very clever use of the infrastructure, the connections that these organized crime groups rather have. So, in order to move people around and move drugs around is a pretty similar process. There are border forces that you need to bribe and have on side. There are routes that you need to use, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, there are very clear parallels. And, if you were just to look at this from an economic and a business point of view, it's very efficient to use the same routes and methods that you use to move drugs around the world as you do humans. So, there is profit in both. Despite the suffering they cause, this is purely seen as a good commercial business decision that makes people money.
In these 2.5 minutes or so we have left on this segment, let's touch a little bit about how the supply chain, who really profits. You have described that, for example, heroin supply chain as a global network from Afghan farmers cultivating opium to corrupt officials enabling its transport around the world and consumers. But the real profit is at the distribution side, at the trafficking side, and the farmers, frankly, are getting a very small percentage of profit. So really, it's for the benefit of the traffickers and the organized crime, isn't it?
It's absolutely. And whether it's cocoa production in Latin America or whether it's opium production in Afghanistan, you're absolutely right. The farmers don't really benefit that much, although many Afghan farmers would say it's more profitable to grow opium than it is cereal crops, for instance. But of course, the Taliban, who've recently or relatively recently taken control again of Afghanistan, have been absolutely adamant that they want to stamp out opium production because they're ideologically opposed to drug use. And I think they've been pretty effective in doing that. So that creates problems in itself. So you might have a reduction in opium supply, but then, very quickly people find alternatives. Organized crime finds alternatives. So what really worries me there is the increase in synthetic opiates, which are relatively easy to produce and distribute compared to heroin. And that's why in the UK in particular, we're seeing real problems with very powerful synthetic opiates beginning to be detected, used, and causing fatalities in the last couple of years as opium production dries up. That said, Afghanistan has record amounts of opium stored. And it's not clear to me that actually the Taliban are withholding that. They seem to be quite happy to reap the rewards of selling that opium to the West, but just not allowing any further production.
Well, thank you very much. We have come to the end of this segment. We'll be right back. And we are back with Ian Hamilton. He's a professor of addiction at the University of York in the United Kingdom. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the shifting drug markets and routes as traditional Western drug markets become saturated, unbelievably so. We're seeing organized crime adapting to target new regions. For example, cocaine seizures in Asia have increased alongside search of methamphetamines. How do these changing market dynamics reflect broader shifts in the global drug trade?
Well, I think the trade in drugs globally reflects the international legitimate trade in other products. A lot of these organizations are truly international. They're not regional. So when one market, as you say, becomes saturated, obviously what they do is they look for growth in a new market, whether it's Africa, whether it's Asia, whether it's the Middle East. It doesn't really matter. They apply their models. They're very nimble and flexible in the way that they look at countries and think about what drugs will appeal, how they can be moved, how they can be produced, and how they can be distributed. So that's what we've seen in Asia, particularly with the really rapid rise in the stimulant methamphetamine, which has proved very, very useful for large organized crime groups and very profitable as well. So it's interesting how certain regions across the globe are attracted to stimulants or depressants or even hallucinogens. So in the West, we've seen depressants like heroin and opiates have an appeal. But interestingly, in Asia, it's mainly stimulants. There is a market for depressants, but that's far outweighed by the market for stimulants. And I think that's because there's a cultural appeal to having something that actually makes you work better, makes you work faster and for longer as well. And equally in Syria with Captagon and across the Middle East, a drug that not only stimulates you but reduces your appetite when food is scarce is a solution to a problem that exists. So these are very clever people and using local intelligence to work out what's going to work where.
Well, thank you. And you mentioned Syria, and I would like to talk about Syria and Russia and how drugs thrive amid war and conflict. Actually, where this stabilization exists, so that's the opportunity, as you mentioned, for drug trafficking to grow. Syria and Russia, you mentioned it, Syria emerged as a drug hotspot, Captagon. Others refer like the drug of jihad. What role is played by war in this dynamic of exploitation and drug trafficking?
Well, actually, it's been a long history of drug use during war. So in the Second World War, we saw the use of stimulants for pilots, for instance, who were on long missions and needed to stay awake for a long time. So even in the modern day, we see that drug use is quite rife, actually, in war zones. Usually, as I say, because it's the attractive qualities that people are looking for is something that gives you stimulation, courage, but also probably suppresses appetite because the logistics of getting food to soldiers, for instance, can be quite difficult in some regions. So if you have a drug that makes you, as a soldier, work for longer, be more alert, but rely on less food, then there's an obvious attraction there. But in Russia, what we see is something quite different. The drug market there is very interesting. As you appreciate, it's quite difficult to get intelligence and information out of Russia, as it is with China, actually. But what we do know about Russia is these kind of drop methods that are used. So people pay for drugs in cryptocurrency, which is untraceable, and also use what are called dead drop techniques, which means that these are also untraceable. So the payment for drugs and the way they're distributed is anonymous and quite difficult to trace. And when you've got someone like President Putin in charge, who's very anti-drug use and views people that use drugs as worthless and contributing nothing to society, then you can understand why it's driven drug use underground. But again, we see the nimbleness in which organized crime and those using drugs respond to that, adapt, and find techniques for continuing to supply and enabling drug use in a country that's effectively under a dictatorship, really.
Well, this alarming issue of developing in Russia with the blind spots where they drop drugs, it's little known about it, but it would seem that because technology is widely available all over the world, that this might be something that will spread out across the world, and that therefore making it even more difficult to combat at the street level the trafficking of drugs and interdiction.
Absolutely, and the development of technology has hugely enabled drugs. Whether that's the ability for people to go online and order drugs, or the ability to pay for anonymously, has made a vast difference to the way drugs are used, distributed, and supplied. Gone are the days when you had to physically meet someone to buy and purchase drugs. You can get these, through the post anonymously, as I say. So that's really been something that's opened up the drug market. So, the advent of the internet has not only helped the legal market in products, but also the illicit market as well.
We are shifting away, as you mentioned, from opioids and mainly cocaine towards the use of synthetic stimulants and synthetic drugs. How is that process evolving? It seems like as the technology develops, even with artificial intelligence to create drugs, we are only at the beginnings of a serious explosion of synthetic drugs.
Absolutely. And, the main driver behind this is that, for instance, drugs like heroin produced from opium are quite bulky. Whereas if you've got a drug that's 100, 200 times stronger, but is a fraction of the size, you can see the appeal for organized crime in that, because you've got less bulk, which makes it easier to move around from border to border, and incredibly efficient. You don't need as much space on a boat or a plane or whatever it is you're using. It makes it harder to detect because if it's smaller, then border forces have a difficulty detecting it. So there's a logic behind it. And also, perhaps you don't need to move it around. If it's synthetic, you can produce it at home. You don't need to import it from China or for it to cross borders. And I think that's what we're beginning to see with fentanyl in the United States. Although Trump reckons Mexico's the main supplier, my hunch is that actually that's beginning to shift. And what we're seeing is US produce fentanyl. People have the know-how. They know how to produce the drug. So why would you go to all the bother of importing it from Mexico if you can produce it in Florida or Texas or wherever it happens to be?
Well, let's talk a little bit about North America, the heart of the opioid crisis. Synthetic opioids like fentanyl, you mentioned, oxycodone, have caused over 100,000 deaths annually in the U.S. since 2021, or abouts, and every family, every community has been impacted by it. Can you walk us through how the opioid crisis began, the role of prescription painkillers you mentioned, Oxycontin, and where we stand today addressing this epidemic?
Very briefly, what happened was there was a significant push by one particular pharmaceutical company and a family involved in that company to encourage prescribers in the US to increase their prescriptions for oxycodone, which is quite a powerful opiate painkiller or analgesic. And that was very, very successful. So, a lot of people who wouldn't normally have been exposed to this drug were given it and unfortunately became dependent very quickly. And once they became dependent, they became reliant on the drug. So we saw really widespread use of a very powerful opiate analgesic spread very quickly across North America. But unfortunately, that was also accompanied by an increase in fatalities, accidental overdoses, because what these opioids did was they caused respiratory depression, in other words, difficulty in breathing. So people weren't, meaning to kill themselves. This wasn't mass suicide. This was mass accidental overdose. And it was classless, it was sexless. So communities that wouldn't normally have been affected, i.e. the middle class, those with more resources, were impacted in a way that we'd never seen before and continue to be.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion. I appreciate so very much the fresh view given us really global approach to drug consumption, to trafficking, and the impact, which normally we lose sight and we focus on our communities and sometimes across our nation. So thank you very much, and I hope to have you back, and I wish you well on your endeavors.
Absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this journey to understand what is at the core of the news. Stay curious, stay informed. Until next time, I look forward to seeing you in our next edition.